The company featured in this podcast is a Stockhead advertiser at the time of publishing.
Hi, welcome to another edition of Health Kick. I'm Tim Borum. Today I'm with Filamon, a private drug developer that's eyeing an ASX listing in the near future. Now, Filamon is developing 7 drug candidates for acute and chronic inflammatory conditions that generally are undertreated. These include dementia, cancer, cardiovascular diseases, chronic lung and kidney diseases, loss of sight and poor mobility, which probably covers about everything, really. Now, Filamon is motivated by 2 key trends. The first is the ageing population generally, and the second is the so-called patent cliff faced by Big Pharma. Now, I've got with me director and co-founder of the company, Professor Paul de Souza, to tell me more. So, welcome, Paul.
Hello, Tim. Thank you for the welcome.
No problems. Well, let's get into it. And I guess the obvious question is how the company came about and why. So just tell me a bit about its origins.
Sure. Although Filamon was established a few years ago, the work actually has been carrying on for 15 years plus. The 3 founders are myself, Graham Kelly, who's well known to your listeners, and one of Australia's serial entrepreneurs, having been the chair of Noxopharm and then prior to that Novogen, as well as other companies. I've known Graham for 15 years or more. In fact, I did the first phase 1 study with him when he was with Novogen, working on their compound. We did 2 phase 1 studies and got to know him then. And over the years, we've corresponded with various projects. I've also been working with Kieran Scott, who's the other founder. Associate Professor Kieran Scott is a cellular biologist and a molecular biologist. And he started life in the Garvan Institute as a research scientist in arthritis. Also had some experience in a startup biotech, just as he tells it, just prior to the financial crash in the late 80s, and then went back to academia. So I've known Kieran for more than 15 years. So Kieran has been working on this particular compound, which is a cyclic peptide. Originally, it came out of his work in arthritis. He thought it was an anti-inflammatory, but it turns out it's much more than that. It's not like your ordinary anti-inflammatory like non-steroidal Nurofen or Panadol. It's actually very specific in the way that it inhibits certain targets. And one day he happened to be talking to a scientific colleague who encouraged him to test it in prostate cancer. And it had excellent effects in prostate cancer cells. And although it's a long story, eventually he tried it in animals, and I convinced him to do a phase 1 clinical trial with the drug, which we did about 5 or 6 years ago, and showed that it was very well tolerated. So that was a really small trial, but it was so successful, meaning that it showed minimal toxicity, and there were some intriguing results that we then convinced Graham to form Filamon. And the purpose of Filamon, amongst others, is to take this particular compound and redo that phase 1 study in a much bigger and longer fashion with many more patients across many cancer types. So it's been a work in progress between all 3 of us for a long time.
Yeah, okay. And your own background, you're a medical oncologist, a consultant, so you've sort of got that practical day-to-day experience in hospitals to augment the academic experience and entrepreneurial experience of the other founders.
Yes, so I'm a medical oncologist. I still practice clinically. I'm also an academic, being a professor of medicine at the University of Sydney now at the Nepean Hospital for the last 3 years. And prior to that, I was the Dean of Medicine at Wollongong. And prior to that, I was Professor of Medical Oncology at Western Sydney University. So I've done a bit of research in my time and seen quite a few patients. And also for a period for 3 years, 20 years ago, I worked as a clinical research physician for Eli Lilly because I was interested in drug development. And I'd like to think that that's provided me with a good perspective of, how drugs get developed.
Yeah, so you're not sort of coming to it from a position of naivety or anything. If you've been with Eli Lilly, you know how the world works, and of course it's a difficult game, drug development, isn't it? Because the odds are fundamentally not in your favour. So I'm just sort of wondering what sort of the company's strategy is in terms of monetising the work it does along the way.
You're absolutely right, Tim. If you took all drugs as a statistical analysis, then, the percentage is not in your favor. But I think Filamon is different from quite a few startups in a number of respects. Firstly, there's this long history that I explained between all of us, and the fact that the founders are still involved in the development of the drug and the development of the company. I kind of contrast it to how I see other biotechs being formed, and that is most of the time the intellectual property comes out of universities through scientists, perhaps, who may not have access to the clinical trials space or commercial realities. And so therefore, those intellectual property, those platforms are taken over by someone who's interested in marketing or comes from pharma experience. But, and importantly here, do not necessarily have a historical connection with that particular compound. I think a lot of biotechs start out that way. So Filamon distinguishes itself because it didn't start out that way. This has been a long-term project, and we just happened to form the company to commercialize it. And obviously, we're still highly invested in how we develop the drug. We haven't handed over anything, essentially. Obviously, we will seek expertise where we need it, but I think that's down the track. The second observation I would make is that we're not a one-trick pony. It's not just Kieran's drug or platform that we are working on. And you mentioned in your introduction there were 7 compounds. Well, maybe not that much, because we will need to hone down and focus on what we do. But we certainly have promising leads on other compounds. So I'd like to think we have multiple shots on goal, if we can take a sporting analogy, so that, investors, it's not make or break in terms of what happens. It's not a success, 1 or 0. That's the outcomes. The other aspect to that is some of the preliminary data that we have seen, at least in the lab and in vitro, are very exciting, although I can't really talk about it. So because we're involved in the game, because we're involved in treating patients, I'd like to think we have an inroad compared to other companies.
Okay, great. Perhaps I could sort of ask you at this stage sort of about the pointy end of things. In other words, your clinical programs. I take it your lead program is called Casonotide, and that targets not one cancer, but a number of solid cancers.
Yes, so we've taken an approach with the platforms that we've developed. They're not single target drugs, which has been the fashion over the last 20 years or so. People used to develop chemotherapy, which was more broad spectrum, but they abandoned that approach and became very, very specific, especially with antibody type drugs, even antibody drug conjugates, but also small molecules with pills targeting a specific pathway or a particular enzyme. With the platforms that we have, it's not just one drug, because of the fact that we've been able to go back to the chemists who have redesigned or tweaked the compounds, attached certain chemical groups, and have come up with better compounds that target different things. So that's why we call them platforms. And although we talk about Casonotide as one drug, that has actually led to a number of other compounds that we are very interested in developing down the track.
Okay. Put another way, I think your trial is called Advice, or your main trial. What does Advice seek out to achieve?
So Advice is a phase 1/2 study. And because we've done the early phase 0, phase 1 study, we're quite confident about the main, achieving the main objective, which is tolerability of a drug. Any phase 1 study the primary aim is to test the toxicity and tolerability of a drug. And secondly, to dose escalate to try and find the maximum dose that patients can tolerate. So the Advice study is no different to any other phase 1 study, but it's also adaptive, which means that we can change the protocol at any point to extend and expand cancers of interest. If we want to study, 6 or 10 patients with prostate cancer, we can do that according to the protocol because of its adaptive nature. So the idea of Advice is that it will accept patients with most subtypes of cancers, and that is because we're not targeting a specific gene or protein product within a particular cancer. We're actually aiming for the supporting structures, and that is the tumor microenvironment. There are no drugs that have been developed to target the tumor microenvironment, which is a complex nest, if you like, that supports cancer cells. So if you think of a tumor, most of the time we think of the cancer cells itself actively dividing and growing. But those cancer cells need nutrients. They need oxygen, they need glucose, they need proteins, amino acids, and so on in order to be able to continue dividing and making new cells. Well, it's those supporting structures that form the tumor microenvironment. We're talking about blood vessel cells, fibroblasts, and so on. And there's a tight interaction, very close interaction between cancer cells and the tumor microenvironment. In actual fact, we now know that cancer cells produce proteins and localized products that influence how those supporting structures, the fibroblasts and blood vessels, behave, and in effect turn the environment to their favor. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the tumor microenvironment. So the casonotide targets some of the supporting structures within the tumor microenvironment. So it's a very novel kind of study. That's why we're able to accept and look for signals in multiple cancers.
Okay. And are you looking for efficacy signals along with the safety data at this stage in phase 1?
Absolutely. As with any phase 1 study, we will monitor patients very closely with blood tests, biomarkers that we hope will predict which patients respond and which don't, as well as scans. And they'll be done very frequently, every 6 to 8 weeks, just like in most phase 1 studies. So although the primary aim is to assess tolerability and absorption and the schedules, the dosing, yes, we're intensely interested to see which patients might respond and then adapt the trial accordingly. That's the aim.
Yeah, so you could go off in a number of directions, depending on results along the way. I guess with clinical trials, the number one aspect is funding, isn't it? So I was just I'm just sort of wondering how well you're funded at the moment, and then perhaps we could talk about your IPO plans in that context.
Sure. I think any biotech can always do with more money.
That's right, exactly.
Currently, we're in the process of a second round of fundraising with the aim of leading to an IPO at some stage, later this year or more realistically early next year, but that depends on the market environment, of course, and advice that we will get down the track. But the study will also aim to provide a continuous news flow. So this is not one of those studies that you have to wait 5 years before you find out the result. Because it's an adaptive study and because we can switch targets and switch cancers at any point, we'll be looking to, publish abstracts and, from an academic point of view, talk about this and present it at various scientific meetings down the track as well. So the aim really is to try and get enough funding from this second round of fundraising to provide a sufficient runway to an IPO.
Okay, and how much are you seeking to raise?
At the moment, around about $5 million.
Okay, so and that's what sort of sources are you tapping? Is that family offices or institutions or a variety of investors?
Yes, I think anybody is welcome.
Anybody.
Yeah, we've been fortunate to get the help of Blue Ocean, who is a broking company. So we'll be guided by them, but it's open to anyone who would like to invest, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the IPO, it sounds like there's nothing concrete at the moment, but it's very much your intention at this stage. Obviously, it depends on market conditions, which are probably a bit iffy at the moment, aren't they? We haven't seen too many IPOs generally.
That's right. It's been a very lean year, 12 months or so for IPOs for biotechs. And we're hoping that environment changes in the next 12 months, but we will be guided by Blue Ocean and the market conditions as to when the IPO happens, but that certainly is the intention.
And for comparative purposes, how would you compare to a current ASX listed drug developer? Is there sort of a near comparative or not really? There's a few pursuing inflammatory pathways like I was going to say Pharmaxis. I think they're called Sonata now. Maybe Noxapharm, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So I don't know that we've got any direct comparators because of our history, because of our platforms. None of the drugs that we're developing are really specifically targeting an individual condition, which is why when you first mentioned in the introduction that we're trying to be, covering all things, well, the potential is there. And obviously each drug will have to, prove itself into any indication that we try. The reason that we are open to all of that is because of the fact that we are targeting things like the tumor microenvironment, which will be applicable to, a lot of cancers. And because some of our drugs are very specifically inhibiting inflammatory pathways, that opens up the avenue for a number of inflammatory conditions, chronic conditions that you also introduced us with.
And it's a fine line, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned you want multiple shots at goal. You've also got to be a little bit selective, and I think you said that because if you have too many programs or indications, investors sort of scratch their heads and say, what is this company really about? It is a fine art, isn't it?
It is a fine art, and our chairman Rob Edgley has consistently told us to focus. So we will be focusing, and obviously is also funding dependent. If we were a $2 billion company, then we could spend on all of these programs without thinking twice about it. But we're not there. And so we will have to be very careful about which ones we choose and pursue.
And finally, you mentioned, and I mentioned in the intro, the patent cliff, which refers to a slew of drugs and a lot of big names coming off patent in the next couple of years and being open to generic competition. So that's a good thing for a developer like yourself to tap some opportunities coming up.
Absolutely, Tim. I think because of the number of indications that our drugs, our platforms could potentially cover, I think there is a great opportunity for some sort of agreement, perhaps, or sale to Big Pharma, depending on what they were looking for to cover their patent cliffs. So the other thing I should mention is that at least a couple of our drugs do not necessarily have to be standalone drugs. They can be given in combination with other treatments. So a big pharma particularly interested in helping to overcome resistance to their particular therapy, for example, in cancer, my field, could well add, one of our platforms to their compounds because of the fact they're not competing. We would be inhibiting the tumor microenvironment and inflammatory factors, and they would be using their own compound targeting whatever the target is, and hopefully provide synergistic outcomes for cancer patients.
I think most of the main new cancer drugs are combination drugs with traditional treatments, or checkpoint inhibitors and such. So it's certainly the way to go. Okay, that's terrific. I've certainly learned a lot more about Filamon, and I hope the listeners have as well. So I look forward to catching up with you again, and perhaps you might even be listed by then. It sounds like it's a case of watch this space.
Well, look, if I can just mention for anyone's interested, I would refer them to our website, www.filamon.com, and you can either register interest or send inquiries about the company. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Tim.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was an enlightening conversation.
All the best.
The company featured in this podcast is a Stockhead advertiser at the time of publishing.